All right, good evening. So there are goodies arriving over here. Who wants to zip over there and get some goodies? I will not be offended. So fresh out of the oven.
Yes.
All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Christianssen. I'm a failed retiree. I taught in Jeffco schools for 39 years, retired a few years ago. And now I'm an adjunct professor at Colorado Christian University, and then I'm assistant chapter director here, working with Donald to help with this club. So that keeps me busy. Yeah.
What did you teach?
So what did I teach? Well, at CCU now I teach two courses. I teach a gen ed class, a science class. So it's a science for non-science majors, gen ed kind of class. And then I also teach freshman biology. My background is in biology. I have a degree in wildlife biology and a degree in entomology, which is insects. What we're going to be doing tonight is thinking a little bit more historically. So I'm not a history person particularly, but I am interested in this just because of the biological aspects of it. And then I have a second degree. It's a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola University, specifically in science and religion. So there's a tie-in to this as well. So before we dive in here, just a query for the audience here. How many of you, honestly, before tonight, have heard of the Scopes monkey trial? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so do you have some sense for what the trial was about? Yeah, what would you say?
It was essentially a trial to see whether it would be legal to teach evolution in public schools. Part of it was a setup. Scopes had knowledge that they were going to be prosecuting him beforehand. He said that he would somewhat aid the prosecution, to my knowledge. However, the ACLU took up the case on the defense. The prosecuting lawyer, William Jennings Bryan, was very bold and made some mistakes, and they lost on a technicality after it got appealed.
Okay, that's interesting. So you have some interesting connections there, and most of this wrong, which I'm not surprised. The Scopes monkey trial regularly gets misrepresented as far as what actually was being tried and who all the people were involved and who won and who lost and so forth. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and we'll dive in here. And what I think we need to do first, I grew up on a cartoon called Mr. Peabody. Have you ever seen that? It came out as a movie, and his boy Sherman, and they would jump in the Wayback Machine, and they would go back in time, and we need to, I think, to understand the whole Scopes trial thing, I think we need to do that a little bit. So that we're not being accused of anachronistic kind of thinking, where we take our understanding of today and paste it onto 100 years ago. So we kind of have to understand what was the culture, what was life like back in 1925 when this trial occurred. So some things to think about. So 1925, we're post-World War I. The world is drastically changing. People's awareness of what's happening around the world is shifting. We used to be very isolated as a country. For a long time, we said we don't want to get involved in anyone's business around the world. And all of a sudden, World War I happens, and now we're engaged in global politics. Also, what's happening in Russia at this time? We have the Bolshevik Revolution, and all of a sudden, communism is becoming this big thing, and it's actually coming on our shores. So we have some different political ideologies that are beginning to infiltrate. So we're getting some new ideas flooding into American culture. And you mentioned ACLU, so ACLU does get involved here. Realize that ACLU just gets started. It was founded in 1920, so just 5 years prior to this. So it's a new entity as well. Yeah.
What's ACLU?
American Civil Liberties Union. It was an independent organization that was all about litigating public rights, human rights. And so anytime people seem to have their rights violated, constitutional rights violated, they would go to court over that. So they've gotten a reputation for being liberal now, and I think they were somewhat liberal then as well. But they have kind of, I think, a good heart about it, but sometimes they take things in the wrong direction. Public schools are growing. One of the things that we kind of take for granted is how accessible education is for us today. It wasn't always the case. Public education was mostly for the elite. And our government started thinking, hey, you know what? It might be a good idea if our general populace was all educated. Things might be going better for us. And so just to give you an idea, so from like 1890 to 1920, the enrollment in what were called public schools increased tenfold across the country. Point being, so now all of a sudden you're having people who are getting exposed to a lot more new ideas that are coming their way. We're going to see as we come along here that radio plays a part of the story here. Radio is kind of a new thing. The first commercial radio broadcast was in 1920. Now, people had been fiddling around with radios for about 10 years prior, making your own little crystal radio sets at home and trying to broadcast things. But in 1920, we had companies that were actually broadcasting and started advertising and things like that. So just 5 years later, and we're seeing this trial is going to be broadcast. We also have cinema is coming on the stage here. So kind of the idea here I'm wanting to think about is you're getting people who used to be very sheltered, very isolated in their small communities, now are getting flooded with all kinds of news and information. And this is, we talked about this as the roaring 20s. It was a wild time because so many things were changing. And how many people in here like change? Oh, one person, okay, so there's always one. But most of us don't like change. We kind of resist change. So kind of understand there's a little bit of this kind of element. Then we have some sense that the trial was about evolution and religion, okay? And how are things sitting there? So there really had been this, what's called a warfare narrative or warfare model that had come out of the late 1800s. This guy Larson said, secular historians and essayists, rather than theologians and scientists, were largely responsible for keeping alive the public perception of hostility between Christianity and evolutionists. So this wasn't coming out of the scientific community or the religious community. You had other forces that were at work. And so there were two historians. So John William Draper wrote this book, History of Conflict Between Religion and Science, back in 1874. Now that seems like a long time ago, but that's 50 years ago from where we're talking about. And back then, most texts were very enduring. And these guys were very, very popular writers, and they were very influential. The other guy that was probably even more influential was Andrew D. White. So he writes this book, History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And so he creates this narrative, and if you read through his book, you see he's putting all kinds of facts in there that are not facts. It's a constructed narrative. And any good historian now will look back and say that was not the case. That Christianity and religion actually go hand in hand. That's a whole other discussion. But the problem is that in the scholarly realms, this idea was very, very popular and was very much promoted in academia, that science and religion are at war with each other. So we've got this kind of an underlying current. The other thing is, in religious circles, there was an advance in Christendom of this thing called modernism, where people were doing biblical criticism, and they were thinking about what are our beliefs compared to our modern time, and how, all of our ideas are changing, and so our religious ideas should be changing as well. And so they started, first of all, questioning things like biblical inerrancy. So the heart of this was at Union Theological Seminary and Princeton Seminary, but it spread from there to a lot of other seminaries. And so they were challenging things like biblical inerrancy. You cannot trust the authority of Scripture. Well, that means there's no miracles. It means there's no such thing as substitutionary atonement. So all of a sudden, all these core doctrines within Christianity are getting rattled. And another thing they do is they're integrating ideas from science. So now understand something here. These things here is causing a lot of division within the Christian church. And there's a lot of pushback against the modernists. But the modernists are having sway in the seminaries. And so anything that's tied to modernism is heavily questioned. And so their willingness to think about, hey, we need to merge science, all the things we're finding out about science, we need to merge that with our belief system. So anything that they're doing is being reacted against. So there's a lot of division that went on in the church over this modernist push. So there were new denominations that were formed, new churches that were formed, new colleges that were established in response to that. So the opposing view to this are what are called the fundamentalists. Now, we have to be careful here, because today the word fundamentalist for many is a very pejorative term. But all it meant, if you said I'm a fundamentalist back in 1925, meant that you were a conservative evangelical. That's what we kind of identify today. So that's the fundamentalist movement's a whole nother discussion, how that kind of took a big turn and a shift on its own and kind of became its own separate thing. But that's not what fundamentalist meant back in 1925. So, like I said, new churches were formed, new denominations were formed, new mission boards were formed, all to kind of preserve Orthodox doctrine. Now, one of the things that came out from about 1910 to 1915 was a series of essays called The Fundamentals. And so R.A. Torrey, guy out in California tied to Biola University, was the editor of this, but he had people write essays supporting all the different major Orthodox Christian doctrines. And so it was just a collection of essays. And what's interesting is that some number of the essays were very, very open to the idea of evolution being a thing. And now, so you're going like, wait a minute. What are you talking about? So here's another thing we have to think about. Back in 1925, what were we talking about when we're talking about evolution? Is it the same thing we're thinking about today? And it really wasn't. So the idea about evolution, that things have changed over time, was very widely accepted in Christian circles. They recognized that Earth has this long biological history. How many of you in here, be honest, would say, have this idea that everything, all life forms that we see today were created as they were 6,000 years ago? Everything. Okay, one of us. So most people are not willing to think that way anymore. Okay? And it's because of what we see in things like the fossil record. Now, you can argue dates and things like that, but we don't have dinosaurs walking around anymore. So life has not always been the way it is today. And somehow, life has changed over time. And frankly, that's all evolution means. So what the question back then is not whether life changed over time, it's what made it change. How did it change? And so this is where Darwin came along. He had his own stick in the fire, but it wasn't the only one in the fire. And what Darwin wanted to promote was some naturalistic explanation when he came up with this idea of natural selection. But scientists of the day in 1925 pretty much had dismissed natural selection out of hand as a sufficient mechanism for getting life to change over time, as we see it. Now, they didn't think natural selection didn't happen, but it couldn't be just natural selection. So people weren't thinking Darwin's idea had much support. Realize also genetics was not understood very well at all. They understood things about selective breeding, and they had identified this idea of genes that animals could have that were heritable, but they didn't know what they were. And of course, the big question with Darwin was, okay, we have to have these changes in the traits, but how do you change traits? They had no information about that. So that was very poorly understood. And then this whole idea of materialism, that everything, the only thing that's in the universe is matter, and that's all there is. And everything has to have like this naturalistic explanation. And back in the 1920s, that was pretty much dismissed. That's silly thinking, that things could just come about by chance because molecules are going around and about. So they weren't materialist thinkers. So even if they didn't identify themselves as Christians, scientists would think that there was some kind of spiritual element to the world that was conspiring to make these things happen. It wasn't just materialism. And so really the question, I think this has been true for all of modern science, from Copernicus on, is not whether there's a God, is to what extent is God doing something in the world? At what points is he intervening and making things happen in the world? And that's what they're really kind of trying to think about. So most Christians would reject Darwinism, but they would still say they were evolutionists because those two terms were not synonymous, okay? Now, here's where things get dark and nasty, because the ideas from Darwin kind of bled into this thing called social Darwinism. So this whole idea of survival of the fittest, we're going to think about what are the fittest traits that something has, and we're going to focus on those. That's kind of what selective breeding is all about. If you're raising chickens or pigeons or whatever, you're going to hone in on particular traits and you're going to breed for those traits. So here's some selections from the textbook that was at issue in the trial. So this was written by George Hunter. He was a British biologist. He writes this book in 1914. So again, textbooks have a long life. So even though this is 10 years later, This is still a textbook that's in use. This book was actually approved by the Tennessee School Board. It was approved text, okay? So notice what he says here. So at the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are, and he kind of lists them. And then notice what he says at the bottom. And finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. What do we have here? This is racism. Okay. Anyway, this is racism, and it's being supported by this idea of selection of the fittest. But on what basis are you saying that the Caucasians are the highest form, right? And then here's a little section about what's called eugenics. So it says, when people marry, there are certain things that the individual as well as the race should demand. The most important of these is freedom from germ diseases which might be handed down to the offspring. Tuberculosis, syphilis, that dread disease which cripples and kills hundreds of thousands of innocent children, epilepsy, and notice this one, feeble-mindedness. So people who have, developmental delays or cognitively depressed or something like that are handicaps which it is not only unfair but criminal to hand down to posterity. We don't want people to inherit these traits. And so the science of being well-born is called eugenics. And so what does he say about eugenics? Parasitism. So hundreds of families, and before this he gives some case studies of some families. So hundreds of families such as those described above exist today, spreading disease, immorality, and crime. They thought crime was an inheritable trait. To all parts of this country, the cost to society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals or plants become parasitic on other plants or animals, these families have become parasitic on society. So what are we going to do about it? So we go on here. So largely from the poorhouse and the asylum exists, so we can put these people away. They take from society, but they give nothing in return. They are true parasites. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Kind of a frank admission. But humanity will not allow this. But we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. So what kind of things is he hinting at? We're talking about things like forced sterilization. We're happening in this country. Anyone know how long these kind of practices went on in the United States?
Decades?
Up into the 1960s.
Yeah.
And we kind of started outlawing it in the 1960s, but in Sweden and in Japan, it continued up into the 1970s. Okay? So these are things that are getting tied in with evolutionary thinking. And what are people thinking about something like eugenics? Was it widely accepted? It actually wasn't. People were pushing back against it. So there's some baggage here. Okay, so we've got a little cultural milieu kind of understanding here. This is the environment we're working from. So how do we get to this trial? What made this trial happen? So in Tennessee, in 1925, the state legislature passes the Butler Act. And here's what it says, word for word. That it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, so that's like elementary schools, and other public schools of the state which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state. So unlawful to what? To teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. That's the law. This is now the law of the land, right? So it was illegal in Tennessee to teach evolution, even though it was in the textbook that they approved, okay? So now the ACLU gets a hold of this, and they start going into action. And they want to make a test case out of this. They want to test the law. So here's an ad that they put in the Chattanooga newspaper. A legal test of the Tennessee law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools and colleges is being sought by the American Civil Liberties Union, a national free speech organization. And so going down here's what it says. Let's look what they're looking for. We are looking for a Tennessee teacher who is willing to accept our services in testing this law in the courts. Our lawyers think a friendly test can be arranged without costing a teacher his or her job. So we're saying, okay, teacher, you have to show that you're breaking the law, but you're not going to lose your job. They're thinking, we can do this. Distinguished counsel have volunteered their services. All we need now is a willing client. By this test, we hope to render a real service to freedom of teaching throughout the country. All right? So the desire here is to do a test case. So this is a bit of a setup job. Now realize that's not unusual. We run test cases through the courts all the time. And we put people in place to do that. So we run things through the court and it gets decided by the judiciary. So this is not unusual. So don't think that. And then appreciate too, that at this time, we all think about the First Amendment, right to free speech. Well, in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment only restrained the government, the federal government, from restricting free speech. It did not reach all the way down into the states. So the question is, does the First Amendment extend down to the states? Must the state governments also ensure or guarantee free speech? Because that was not the case at this time. So this ad goes out in the newspaper, and the town leaders in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee, notice it. And they're thinking, what? And this is the town leaders. It's kind of a setup picture. They're sitting at the drugstore, and one of them says, hey, did you see this ad in the paper from the ACLU? They want to do a test case. And they're thinking, this sounds like a court case that would catch a lot of attention. If we could bring this trial to Dayton, not only would we attract a lot of attention, we would attract a lot of money. That's what they were looking at. This could be good for our town. It would put our town on the map, okay? But who's going to be this teacher? So you've got your own little high school in Dayton. So they went to the biology teacher, had a little conversation with him, but he's a family man. Wife, got kids. I don't want to risk losing my job because that's no good for me. So it's a small high school. Who else do you go to? So they then go to this guy, John Scopes. Scopes was fresh out of college. He'd only been out of college a year. He was teaching at the school. He was the chemistry physics teacher. He also was the football coach. And on occasion, he did substitute teaching for the biology teacher. So he actually had put feet in the biology classroom. So here's our guy. This is John Scopes. Okay? So they asked him if he would be willing to do that, to take on that role, because he was aware of the biology textbook that had the evolution stuff in it. What's interesting is that after the trial, when they were interviewing John Scopes, he said he couldn't remember if he actually had taught evolution or not. Okay? But he was in the classroom where they were using the book that had evolution in it. So it definitely was a stretch, but he was a willing participant. They also had to get corroborating witnesses. So they had to enlist some of the high school students who would also be willing to testify that they heard John Scopes teach evolution in the class. Complete setup job. Okay? If John Scopes can't remember if he taught evolution or not, these kids don't remember. You remember high school. How much do you remember what your teachers told you? Yeah, right. That's exactly what I thought. Yeah. Okay, so here's the newspaper. Evolution bootlegger. So in 1925, what are we talking about here? What was a bootlegger? Running alcohol, because alcohol was illegal. Okay, but he's not bootlegging alcohol. He's bootlegging evolution, right? I think that's kind of funny. So this is the articles that appears in May. So this is kind of a short timeline. The law is approved in March. This article appears in May. He's actually arrested on May 9th. They have to have a grand jury. They've got to throw down the evidence, say this we think we've got a case here. So he's indicted by a grand jury on May 25th, and the trial is set for July 10th. Boom, boom, boom. Here we go. Okay. All right, so now who is going to try this case? Well, the one most people have heard about is this guy named William Jennings Bryan. And it's funny because he was not the lead prosecutor. He couldn't be because he wasn't living in Tennessee. He lived in Florida. That was his residence, so he couldn't be a lead prosecutor, but he's asked to join the prosecution team. So who is this guy? So he's a pretty notable guy. He used to live in Nebraska, and he was representative in Washington, D.C. for the state of Nebraska for a time. He was a 3-time nominee for president. This guy's a well-known guy. If you're the nominee for president, and he did it 3 times. So he's a well-known figure. Then under Woodrow Wilson, he serves as Secretary of State. So again, more notoriety to him. And he really made a name for himself because after all that political life, he became a public speaker. Now, that's not something we have today so much. But people used to go around and they made a living by giving speeches in public. You know, before you had the movie theater and you had the radio, you had what? You'd have people come to town and they would give speeches. So this is what he would do. And so he was going around the country and he would give 250 speeches a year. And he's traveling all over the country doing this. So if we're talking about celebrity, this is a guy who was extremely well known. He was a big celebrity. So what is his interest? Well, so he was an ardent fundamentalist. Part of, when he was on his speaking tour, one of the things that he would rail against was the teaching of evolution. So a couple pamphlets that he published. One is called The Menace of Evolution, and another one, Darwinism in the Schools, published just a couple years before then. Some of his chief concerns, one is that evolution is a theory without any facts. So if you've ever read Origin of Species, you notice there's a lot of anecdotal kind of data in there, like good old Darwin's finches. Oh, isn't it interesting that we have all these different species of finches on this one island, and they eat different things? And so he's thinking, ta-da, natural selection. Well, neat, but how did it come about that this happened? How did you get all those different changes? There's no evidence for it. It was pure speculation. So there's an idea there, but there was no evidence behind it. but there were these other things that were tied in with Darwinism. So the social Darwinism thing. So he's very concerned about those things. These are Darwin's words. He was very much against some of the medical practices that were being employed to keep these weaker humans around. And all you're doing is weakening the human genome by keeping these sick people around, which preserved lesser traits. That's all we're doing when we practice medicine. And where does medicine come from? Where did all that come from? That was a Christian ethic. Wherever Christianity has gone in the world, what followed? It was hospitals, it was schools, right? And so Darwin really was pushing back against this Christian ethic of helping people in their suffering because they were lesser traits that we were preserving in the population. The other thing he was really railed against was about tax dollars. So tax dollars are being spent to teach this whole evolution thing, which then, as it is now, is somewhat of a minority view. And so why should the majority of people be expected to pay for a minority view to be taught in the public schools using taxpayer dollars? So that was another thing that he was very, very concerned about. So how does he get roped into all this? Well, again, remember he was going around on this circuit speaking. And so he was a keynote speaker at the World's Christian Fundamentals Association convention in Memphis, in Tennessee. And when he was there, one of the leaders of the organization, they approached him and said, hey, here's what we've got going on in Tennessee. This is like in your back pocket. Do you think you could help us with this? And so he agreed because this looked like a perfect opportunity for him to rail against forced education of evolution, particularly using tax dollars. And he was really concerned about this, what's called majoritarianism, the majority rule. Which weighs more favorably in our society? Is it free speech, or is it the more, what the majority wants? And he was favoring what the majority wants. So realize this guy was a big celebrity, really well known. So how does that shift things for this case? Well, this breaks things wide open. This now gets national attention because you have a nationally known figure who has now joined the prosecution. So what does the defense do? Who are you going to get to defend John Scopes? Now, they had their own local attorneys who were representing him, who represented the defense for him. But Clarence Darrow, how many of you have ever heard of Clarence Darrow? Yeah, a few of you. So Clarence Darrow, at the time, was considered probably the top defense attorney in the country. He also was nationally known. One of the trials that he tried most recently was this trial for these two teenage boys, Loeb and Leopold. You remember what they did? Yeah.
Didn't they kidnap a little girl and murder her and pour acid on her?
Well, a little boy. It was a little boy, a little 14-year-old boy, and they murdered him just to see what it would be like to murder somebody. These two teenage boys came from very wealthy families, so they were willing to pay big dollars to pay a defense attorney to come and defend their sons. Because in 1925, if they were convicted, what was their fate?
Death penalty?
Death penalty. Okay? So what Clarence Darrow argued was that these boys were just a product of their environment, a product of their genes, as it were. And so they couldn't be expected to be held responsible for the crime that they committed. And so it would be wrong to put them to death. and the courts agreed. And so they got life in prison, is what they got. Loeb was killed in prison. He was knifed in the shower. Leopold actually got paroled, and after he was paroled, he went and lived in quiet life in Puerto Rico. But he got him off. And in today's dollars, he got $350,000 to try that case. So it was big money for him and a lot of notoriety. So again, he was really, really well known. He had a strong reputation of being strong. Now, when I read different articles, people refer to him as agnostic, but he really was a staunch atheist. He was very anti-Christian. Sometimes we would reframe that, say not he was not an atheist, but he was an anti-theist. He was against Christianity. He talked about Christianity being the religion of slavery, is what he referred to it. Now, he actually spoke very favorably about eugenics early on. He was okay with this idea of gassing people who had unfavorable traits. But later on in life, he kind of changed his mind a little bit because he was kind of thinking about, okay, so exactly who gets to decide what the good traits are and what the bad traits are, and how do we know? So he kind of started rethinking his support of eugenics. But early on, he was in line with that. Now, so realize though, his real interest is demonstrating that evolution was compatible with Christianity. There is no conflict there. But more importantly, he wants to completely diss Christianity. That's really at the heart of what he wanted to do. So, does the ACLU want him on their team? No, they do not want him on their team. They were not interested in his help because, as well known as he was a little bit infamous that he would do these underhanded tactics as a defense attorney to manipulate juries and manipulate the court system to get things to go his way. And they were afraid that if Darrow comes on the defense team, that this is going to side rail what they're trying to do. He's going to mess this whole thing up. But Darrow wants a piece of the action. Why? Because William Jennings Bryant is on the prosecution team, and he hates William Jennings Bryant, and he wants to be the opposing counsel. So ACLU won't invite him, so he goes to Scopes and asks Scopes himself, would you like me to be on his defense team? Now put yourself in the position of John Scopes. He's sweating bullets now. He thought this was going to be kind of an under-the-radar kind of operation. Yeah, we'll do this little court trial and everything, and it'll just be done within the summer, and I can go back to my work and my own business. Now, all of a sudden, you've got this national figure, William Jennings Bryant, who's going to be prosecuting you. And this is getting national attention. So what does John Scopes want? He wants the best guy in the business, so he says yes. So now the ACLU can't do anything because Scopes is the defendant and he gets his way. So now here's where things get really interesting because remember we have another player in this whole thing and it's the townspeople. Okay? And this is now getting national attention. So a big Chicago radio station brings down all the latest tech down to little Dayton, Tennessee, because they're going to broadcast the trial. Now, in your recollection, how many trials get broadcasted publicly? Almost none. In recent history, what famous trial got broadcast?
O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, O.J. Simpson. And what was that like? It was an absolute media circus. Judge Ito should have been roundly castigated for allowing that to happen because what everyone was afraid was going to happen did happen. And so no surprise, we're going to have the same thing kind of going on here. They brought in extra telegraph lines and things and telephone lines so that the reporters who were all going to descend on Dayton could call in and submit their stories to their newspapers back in New York or wherever. You can see in this picture, they've built platforms within the courtroom so that these cameras, so they had still cameras, they had movie cameras that were in the courtroom. And they even set up stuff outside because they knew the courtroom was limited in size. We're going to have a lot of people here. So they set up all these benches and everything and had big speakers outside so people could sit outside the courtroom and listen to what was going on inside. And then the whole town people got on the bandwagon here. So there were 6 city blocks or town blocks that were all lined with different kinds of booths and things where people were selling merch to make a buck. So this is a museum display. They were selling little stuffed monkeys. You guys remember these kind of monkeys? I think they're creepy. Right? So the creepy monkeys. Here's mugs that have all the William Jennings Bryan on them, and they even in the hotel. They had brought in a gorilla from some zoo somewhere and put the gorilla on display in the hotel. And this guy here, this is the chimpanzee, his name's Joe Mindy. And they dressed him up and paraded him around because this is like the monkey trial, right? So absolute circus. Okay, so real quick, let's refresh all the issues that are going on here. What's all coming to pair in little Dayton, Tennessee? So one, you've got the ACLU. What are they interested in? They're wanting to test this idea of academic freedom and free speech. Can universities teach whatever they want to? You've got the city leaders. They're interested in money. How do we make a buck off of all this? You have Brian, who is there to stamp down evolution. You've got Clarence Darrow, who wants to uphold evolution and tamp down Christianity. And then you have the state courts. What are they interested in? Remember what they're doing. They're testing a new state law. All they're interested in is, did John Scopes violate the Butler Act? That's all they care about. So what do we have? So we've got 5 sticks in the fire here, and everyone's got something that they want to get out of this thing. So we have a circus all set to go here, right? So let me walk you through the trial real quickly here, so you get a feel of how things went in the trial. So the trial it ran for 8 days, from July 10th to the 20th. What do you think Tennessee is like in July? Really hot, really humid, and they have extremely good air conditioning.
1925.
None. Okay. And they're all, these two guys, Brian and Darrell, they are all set for notoriety. So the first day of the trial is Friday, and then of course they recess. And on that weekend, what does Brian do? Brian goes around and he's doing public addresses in the public square, and he preaches at the Methodist Church on Sunday. He's all about getting attention for himself. So he definitely has some ulterior motive here. His motives maybe aren't all pure. And so, like all trials, we were just talking before, the nature of trials, it's not like the Perry Mason show. The first several days, what do you have going on in trials? Well, it's jury selection, you're kind of arguing procedural concerns, and all the while, the public's listening to this. What's the public doing? They're like, really? This is what we signed up for? Not very exciting, so attention starts to wane. I don't know if somebody started kind of like poking the prosecutors and the defense. Town leaders are probably saying, come on guys, you gotta kind of ramp this thing up here, or we're gonna lose out here. So things finally do start happening. So early on, one of the defense attorneys, he makes the claim that the state law is unjust, but notice his phrasing. He makes this comparison that people who are critics of Darwinism, now this is Darwinism, not just evolution, but critics of Darwinism, he likens them to 16th century peasants who opposed Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism. What's he doing there? What kind of argument do we call that? That's ad hominem, right? He's not attacking the argument, he's attacking the people, okay? So already becomes a very contentious kind of environment, because who's he talking to? He's talking to the people of Tennessee who mostly are opposing evolution in the classroom. So he's not gaining any friends here. And so after Hayes goes, then Darwin gets up and he offers up a 2-hour monologue. Did anyone ever endure a 2-hour monologue? Okay, one person. Okay, we have a hard time relating to that, but that would not have been uncommon. So think about, remember Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? How long was it?
8 minutes.
Not even that. It was like a 5-minute speech. And when he was done, it's like, so when's Lincoln speaking? Oh, he already went. What? Because usually if somebody got up and spoke, they would speak for like at least an hour. So for him to come up and give a 5-minute speech, no one even knows. No one even knows. They had to read it in the paper the next day. So he gets up and he does this monologue, and it's all about berating Christianity and how, what he says, that the most intelligent Christians accept evolution. Again, he's kind of doing this ad hominem kind of dig here. But at this point, Darwin realizes he needs to kind of shift his strategy, okay? Rather than dissing on the Christians, he thinks, I need to bring people in to show that evolution and the Bible don't conflict. So he wants to bring in a bunch of scientists who are going to speak on the behalf of the defense to show that, yes, they are Christians and they believe in evolution. So he gets to bring in this one guy from Johns Hopkins. So he's coming from East Coast, right? He makes a pretty big trip to get to Tennessee to get here. They bring him on, and very, very quickly at the beginning of his testimony, the judge doesn't like what he's seeing, and he asks the jury to go out. And sequester the jury during this testimony. So he gets to give his testimony, and he says some interesting things, which I think is very telling about evolution of the day. He said, evolution and the theory of evolution are fundamentally different. He's making a distinction here. So the fact of evolution, that is, life has changed over time, is a thing that is perfectly and absolutely clear. You got the bones. But there are many points, theoretical points, as to the methods by which evolution has been brought about that we are not yet in possession of scientific knowledge to answer. He's saying, we have no idea, the change happened, but we have no real solid idea how this happened. So it's actually probably not the best testimony for Darwin, because he's confessing we don't have a lot of evidence for this, okay? But they challenge the use of expert testimony. And so everything that Metcalf says in his testimony is stricken from the record. The jury does not get to see it when they deliberate. So Thursday comes along, Brian gives an hour-long monologue against evolution. The defense attorney, Dudley Malone, gets up and he gives a rebuttal, and he scores big points on his rebuttal because he appeals to American ethic. We feel we stand with progress. We feel we stand with science. We feel we stand with intelligence. We feel we stand with fundamental freedom in America. So everyone in the court was like, hey, he's a good guy. So then Friday, Darrow keeps wanting to press this idea of having expert testimony coming in. But the judge is not liking this at all. And Brian pushes back and says, well, if you're going to seat these experts on the stand, then I have the right to cross-examine. And Darrow's like, oh yeah, didn't think about that. Okay? Because what does he know is going to happen? Well, Brian's probably not going to challenge them on their science, but he's going to probably challenge them on their Christian beliefs and demonstrate, yeah, you really aren't a Christian. So they're not the same. So your supposition is false. So Darrow capitulates a little bit. He says, well, can we at least have their testimony, written testimony, entered into the record and as an affidavit, but we won't put them on the stand so they don't get cross-examined. So the judge says, okay, we can do that. So that kind of starts going on Monday, and then Darrow does this really interesting turn in his strategy. He calls a witness. He calls a witness who is going to be a religious expert who can testify to the veracity of Christianity. And who does he call to the witness stand? William Jennings Bryan. And what does Bryan do? Oh yeah, I'm on it. So he goes on the stand. Now, here's what's interesting. It was so swelteringly hot that the judge says, let's take this outside. You've got all this stuff set up outside. Let's do this outside. So that's what this picture is here. So Darrow first identifies Bryan as a hostile witness. So who's in control of the questioning? Only Darrow. Only Darrow. The prosecution can't object. So he takes control of this examination. So they start peppering him with all these questions about the Bible. We'll talk about those in a second. And this isn't looking good. This is not looking good. And the chief prosecutor tries to interrupt this line of questioning 12 times. And what does Bryan do? No, I got this. And so it goes on and on and on. And finally, the judge says, I've had enough of this, and he ends it. End of the day, we're closing court for the day. Okay? And then Darrow does something, then the judge was not happy about this testimony. So all this stuff that went on between Bryan and Darrow gets stricken from the record. The jury doesn't get to see it. Because it's irrelevant. The judge keeps saying, this is not what we're trying here at this court case. So but then what happens? So let me talk just a little bit about the kind of questions that Darrow threw at him. He asked him questions about these really weird things we have in the Old Testament. Like, okay, so who was Cain's wife? And he pesters them on that. And of course, he has no great answer. But he said, I trust in the Bible, it must have happened. But I can't explain it. And he talks to him about Jonah and the whale. And remember, there's that episode with Joshua where it's said that the sun stood still so they could go longer in battle. And so he's challenging him on like, okay, so how long's a day and how do days happen? And do you think the earth really stopped moving for an hour? Do you really think that happened? And of course, Bryan's fallback is, well, I don't know how it happened. The Bible said it happened, so it must have happened. That's all he says. Now, what's interesting is that a couple of the things that Darrow tried to pin on Bryan was ask him, how old do you think the earth is? And Bryan's kind of agnostic about that. I don't know. Could be 6,000 years, could be 6 million years. I don't know. I don't care. Doesn't matter. So you can't pin him down on that point. He also tries to pin him down on biblical literalism. Do you take everything in the Bible literally? And Bryan says, well, no, of course not. There's all kinds of, when the Bible says you are the salt of the earth, what does that mean? Like you're literally salt? No. So he couldn't pin him on that. What's also interesting is Darrow never asks him anything about human evolution, which was the center. You remember the Butler Act? That's what that centered on. It wasn't centering everything about evolution. It was centered on human evolution. And Darrow never asks him anything about human evolution because he knows how that will go. Because Bryan will come back and say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And in 1925, what did they have? Zero. They had the Piltdown Man. And what do we know about Piltdown Man?
Fake, right?
It was a hoax. It ended up being a hoax, okay? All right, well, so now things come to an abrupt end, much to Brian's chagrin. Because what he was expecting is to be able to come back in court the next day and grill Daryl, and then ultimately be able to give a summation that he had been working on for months, fine-tuned it. But Daryl passes a fast one on it. He says, we're changing our plea. My client is guilty. Changing our plea. And so the judge sends it to the jury in 9 minutes. They have a verdict. He is guilty. Now, why does he do that? Well, he's really sticking it to Brian here. He knows exactly what's going to happen. If they plead guilty, that's the end of the trial. And the prosecution doesn't have any right to make a summation. It's the end. Wow, you just pulled the sheet right out from underneath of me. And so Scopes, he's judged as guilty. They fine him the $100. It was the minimum fine for breaking the Butler law. And so Brian doesn't get his day in court. So interesting then, what does Brian do? Well, so he actually feels like things went well. They got the verdict they wanted. Scopes was guilty. But he didn't get to give his summation, but he thinks, I got good stuff here. So I'm going to rewrite this a little bit, and I'm going on the road with this. So he's going to go on another speaking tour, delivering his summation. And he was feeling good. He was feeling pretty healthy, feeling pretty good. Started planning this next tour, and he dies. Dies in his sleep. What? He just died. Now, what we're suspecting is that he had diabetes. He was hot, he was tired, and his body just gave up on him. So this is his death certificate. I found his death certificate. It says he died of apoplexy. It was like a stroke. He didn't. Now, his wife did take his summation argument, and she did publish it. So Brian's last message actually did get published, but it doesn't get the hearing that it would have gotten if he had gone on the speaking tour. So what's the legal aftermath? What happens? So one of the reasons Daryl pulled the fast one on Brian is because he knew if he was found guilty, they would then have the opportunity to appeal at the state Supreme Court, and that's really what he was gunning for. So we're going to go to a higher court to make this decision, not just this lower court. So, so Scopes doesn't have to pay his fine. You wait for the Supreme Court to rule on this, so you don't have to pay the fine. The court doesn't get its day, they don't get their day in court until 2 years later. And at the Supreme Court, they throw the whole thing out. They dismiss his fine on technicality because it was the judge who assigned it. It was supposed to be the jury who assigned the fine, not the judge. So on a technicality, Scopes does not have to pay his fine. So he's off scot-free. But so the Butler Act stays in force. And so in the state of Tennessee, the textbook companies were very well aware of this decision. So they shifted. They changed their textbooks. They took evolution out of the textbook. Even Hunter, who wrote the quotes that I shared earlier, he rewrites his textbook and takes that stuff out of it. So it's not in there anymore. And the Butler Act stays in force until 1967, when it finally gets thrown out. There's only like 2 other states in the country at that time that have anti-evolution rulings. And so it gets thrown out. Now, in terms of public perception, what did the public think? The public just saw this as a money grab. It was a circus. So it actually didn't get much push either direction. People who've done research on the kind of follow-up in the newspapers and things that happened after this, it did not make a big a splash as people had hoped it would, because they just saw this was just a kind of a media circus. All right, so there you go. There's the Scopes trial. So looking back 100 years, do we think there have been some ripple effects to the Scopes trial? What kind of things do you think have emerged from that? Did it just all quiet down and just disappear? Yeah.
An emphasis on free speech at every level.
Okay, so that was one thing that got pushed in that direction. So this whole idea of majoritarianism got pushed aside in favor of academic freedom and freedom of speech. So that really did get elevated. So there was that kind of win to this court case. It did help do that. What else? Yeah.
People didn't stop trying to teach evolution in public schools.
Right. So it still kind of went on. So this push to keep bringing evolution into the classroom continued. The Butler Act never got enforced. So even in Tennessee, people would still try and bring evolution into the classroom, but nobody bothered to enforce it. Yeah.
Eugenics and social Darwinism declined, most likely for other reasons, but
for other reasons, but yeah.
Yeah.
So it got a little bit of a hearing, it got a little bit of attention, and I think some wisdom prevailed on that, thankfully. So have there been other court cases about teaching evolution in the classroom? There actually have been a lot of them, and we won't go down that. But that has been a kind of a constant reciprocal thing that keeps going on. But the narrative and the arguments keep shifting about what is being taught and how it should be taught. So this definitely had an effect. So, but what about us? Is there any lessons that we could learn from the Scopes trial? Mistakes that were made that, maybe we should do some things better? Yeah.
The involvement of media really muddled everything.
Yes. Okay. Which is definitely a current theme for today, isn't it? Okay, just understanding the power of media and how it affects social conversation, right? I'm seeing that a lot. What else? I got ideas, but I thought I'd throw it out to you. Yeah.
It's really hard to keep the conversation focused on what is supposed to be the main point. Like, it just went all over the place, right?
It did, because everyone had a different stick in the fire,
Right.
right? Everyone wanted to make their point. They weren't aligned on what point we're trying to make.
Right.
So how do we do that? What do we need to do?
I'm terrible at it, so I don't know.
Yeah.
it definitely seemed to be more about money and fame rather than actual truth and the law.
Yeah. What do we really want to? Is it just about maturity? Is it about free speech, or is it really about truth? What do we really want to try and hone in on? Getting at truth more than anything else. Well, here's some of my thoughts here. One, like Eric said, is recognize the power of media. Was, I think, very influential. H.L. Mencken, you guys know who he is? He was really, let's say, he was the, well, you guys know the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse? Okay, he's like one of those guys. He was a well-known atheist, and he was a journalist for the New York Times. And he covers the trial for the New York Times. Do you suppose he put his slant on it? He did, in a really, really big way. He misrepresented what happened in the trial. And then later on, reporting about the trial shifted greatly. There was a movie made back in 1955 called Inherit the Wind. Anyone ever seen that? A few of you, okay? They used to be shown all the time in public schools. And now I think that's kind of shifting now. But it's not a documentary. it's like a movie based on kind of thing, but it hugely distorts what happened in the trial. One of the scenes in the end of the trial, they have the Darrow figure peppering the Brian figure with these questions. And he just becomes this sniveling, weak guy on the stand. So much so that at the end of the movie, right there on the stand, he has a heart attack and dies. He's so beside himself that he can't muster support for his faith. And he's just made an absolute fool of. That is not what happened with Brian on the witness stand. And they also add some other nefarious characters that were never in the trial. So the telling of the story gets kind of muddled from the media. The other thing is to think about what is the real controversy that we get. Sometimes we get shifted too far. We get a little off track of what the real controversy is. It really isn't about evolution and faith per se. What's really at the heart of it is materialism. Because even though back in 1925, the scientists of the day were not strong materialists, materialism begins to rebound in terms of metaphysics in the scientific community. And so C.S. Lewis, if you've ever read his book Miracles, that's what it's all about. It's more about dissing the idea of naturalism than it is defending the idea of miracles. Because if God can exist, then he can do miracles. That's it. But what about naturalism? And naturalism has a lot of problems, and that's what he really does in his book on miracles, is he argues against naturalism. And then Alvin Plantinga, he's a philosopher out at Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Where the Conflict Really Lies. And it's not in the particulars of science, it's at this underlying current in science about naturalism. So it's about theism versus naturalism. That's really at the heart. And I think it would bode us well to kind of, when we talk to people about science and faith kind of issues, if we would bore down into that issue and not get wrapped up in some of the particulars. People have like facts that they heard, right? Those are, in the moment, are hard to follow up on and justify. Well, prove it to me. And you get nowhere. But if you can take the conversation down into which makes more sense, naturalism or theism, to help explain the world around us, then we can kind of get away from the particular facts and whether we got our facts right or not. The other thing is being able to differentiate between religious views and scientific evidence. And sometimes things get muddled a little bit. So realize that a lot of arguments against evolutionary theory are not regarded as religious views. But this was the case. This was a point that Darrell tried to make. If you're trying to contradict evolution, then you're bringing in a religious view. It's like, well, not necessarily. Just because if you are critiquing a theory, that's not a religious view, unless evolution is a religious view. Are you willing to admit that? Right? So which is it? Is it a religious view or is it not? Or are we free to critique theories? We should be able to critique theories. The other thing is this whole idea we mentioned about free speech versus majority rule. This is something that we want to uphold. What has been very interesting in the scientific community is things have kind of flipped. And now one of the problems that a lot of scientists have is that they are being silenced for critiquing evolution. So long string of anecdotes of scientists who've had their papers rejected from journals because they say something that would disagree with evolution. And lots of stories about professors who lose their jobs and things like that because they say something against evolution. So we have this kind of okay, yeah, we've created this free speech environment, but free speech actually isn't as free as we would think it is. So we've got to kind of be aware of that. One of the big challenges we need to think about, I think, is how do we engage in civil discussion with people and not just enter into our echo chambers? You know what I mean? Okay, because there is this tendency to do that. And so do we just, self-confirming bias kind of stuff? We just talk to ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for how smart we are? Or are we willing to engage in conversation with people and get an understanding of where people are coming from and identify terms like evolution? We don't have time for this tonight, but when someone says, well, I believe in evolution, well, just don't assume you know what they mean by that. Tell me what you mean by evolution. What do you think that really means? What do you really believe in? And then what evidence do you have to support that? You're not defending anything, right? You're just asking them, just getting information about what do you mean. So learning about how to have that kind of civil engagement. And then bottom line, especially in regards to William Jennings Bryan, I think his big failure in this whole thing was when he succumbed to the challenge. The gauntlet was thrown down by Darrow, and he capitulated. He said, yeah, I'll do it. Why? Why did he do that?
I would say pride in his own image.
That's exactly it. And he wasn't willing to get off the stand, right? When the lead prosecutor was saying, Willie, I think you need to get off. Oh no! And he just kept going. And I think it was because of his pride. He wanted to one up Darrow, and he ended up making himself look really bad. And so I think that calls us, one, to be good apologists. That's what we try to do here at Ratio Christi. Learn not just what we believe, but how do we know these things are true? What evidence do we have? Philosophical, historical, scientific evidence. What do we have? So be good apologists, but also be willing to be humble. If somebody brings a question up to you and you're not sure what the answer is, don't fake it till you make it. Just say, yeah, I don't know. Can I look that up and get back to you? But be willing to be humble, and I think that goes a lot further than willing to step in with our pride and make fools of ourselves, like Brian did. Hopefully we won't do that. So to me, those are some takeaways. I'm going to leave you with one last thing here, and then I'll let Grayson close out. Here's a Gallup poll. This is a survey that was taken over the last 40 years. I wish they had data going further back. 3 questions that they're asking people. This is about human origins. This is not just evolution in general. It's specifically on human origins. So this green line here is that God created humans in their present form 10,000 years ago. The blue line, dark blue line here is humans developed over millions of years, but God kind of guided the process. And then this dotted blue line, this is people who are saying humans came about just purely by evolutionary mechanisms. So notice a couple things about the graph. How much have things changed in 40 years? Not a whole lot, okay? We're seeing a little bit of growth here, but these aren't changing very much. So we don't have strong forces that are changing people's opinions about these issues. And there's 2 kind of majorities here, which is interesting to think about. You have 71% of people who think God was somehow involved in human origins, one way or the other. But then you also have this majority. You have 58% of the people who are thinking evolution has something to do with the origin of humans. Isn't that interesting? So that's our current culture today. We're current reality. So kind of take that with you as you think about interacting with friends and neighbors on these kind of topics. All right, it's 8:30. Grayson, why don't you close us out here, and I'll be happy to hang around and talk afterward.
But first,
hit the camera.
yes. Here, we can give Carl a round of applause.
Oh, and one thing, let me just add on one thing. If this has piqued your interest at all, you're kind of wanting to know more about the Scopes trial and all the stuff went on. I just gave you a sketch of what happened. But this book by Edward Larson is really, really good. He covers the whole thing from a lot of different angles, and I think he's very fair-handed in taking a look at what happened and why things happened the way they did. And this particular edition